I'm very excited about this panel specifically because we all live here. We all live here and we all see all of the different ways that hostile environment permeates through our society, whether that's through policing or, like NSARS. We have someone from NSARS that's going to be speaking today. I'm very excited about, or with borders, or with even in the healthcare system, the educational system, all of these things to push people out that are considered, not wanted or othered. So I think that this panel is incredibly important because it really bridges together a lot of these realities. So with that, I would like to go ahead and send it over to, I call her Mars, but Marciana, who is going to be our moderator for this panel. So thank you so much, Marciana.
Thank you, Jamila. And thank you to all of our amazing panelists. Everyone can hear me? Thumbs up, perfect. Okay, so as Jamila mentioned, the title of this, this really exciting and very international panel is Hostile Environment, Borders, Policing, Prisons, and the Public Good. And we have an incredible lineup of panelists who will shortly introduce themselves. But just to set up a little bit of the framing for this specific panel, we're playing with the terminology of hostile environment in part because it's really potent for this conversation, but also in the UK, hostile environment and making life inhospitable for migrants is an actual and official government policy. In Northern Europe, we've seen the welfare state become an extension of violence and surveillance against refugees and asylum seekers. In Nigeria, identity is policed through internal borders, and on the Greek island of Lesbos that Salim will go into, hostile environment is birthing a really burgeoning anti-authority movement. So we're going to dig into all of these really important topics and the connections between all of them, and really look at all of the different facets of how borders manifest physically, institutionally, and ideologically, and how activists and organizers are actually fighting back against them. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists and just start out with a very kind of open question: is what led each of you to do the work that you're doing, and kind of what is your origin story in the context of your work? So maybe I'll slower. Okay. Yes. I know. As yes, work a lot along language justice. Thank you to the interpreters for doing such an amazing job. So just to start off, again, to each of the speakers, and Aliyah, I'll turn it over to you first, but what led you to the work that you do, and really what is your origin story?
Thanks, Marjana. I just want to say it's such an honour to be here and very exciting to be on this international panel. I'm Alia Yule. I was born in the UK to two migrant parents who had very different experiences. My dad was from South Africa. He was Jewish and he moved to the UK in the middle of apartheid. And my mum is from Pakistan and she moved to the UK when she was very, very young. My family was always really political, but I think I remember sort of the first conscious moment, which may, depending on the attendees, make me very old or very young, was going to the protests against the Iraq War. And how life in the kind of aftermath of the war on terror changed for my family, for my Muslim family after that. And I was really politicized sort of further during when I was at university, the introduction of tuition fees, which I know for my American friends may sound insane, but yeah, we were outraged that the government was charging us to attend university. And also whilst I was there, so these attacks on the sort of welfare state more broadly, but I was also very active in our Palestine Society and seeing how political views, particularly anti-racist, anti-imperialist views, like opposing the war on terror, opposing the war in Iraq, and pro-Palestinian views were criminalized. And I think a lot of those processes of criminalization relate very much to how migrants, undocumented migrants, are criminalized in the UK today. So I think that's a kind of connection of all of those things is how I ended up working at Migrants Organize. Yeah.
Thanks, Alia. And how about you, Yemi? What brought you to the work that you're doing?
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Serendipity, I'd say, really. A friend of mine invited me to a protest in 2010. I'd just finished an MBA, moved back to Nigeria. It was during my year of service. We have a mandatory year of service. So I wasn't really doing much. Sounded exciting, so I went. Since it was my year of service, I had a bit of time. And after the protest, there were two, one in our commercial capital, one in our administrative capital. And after the protest, there was a conversation around, okay, we can't protest every time we are angry, so what do we do now? Elections were the following year. So there was a narrative around getting young people engaged in the electoral process as a means of having voice in Nigeria's governance structure. We got 2 grants from 2 US organizations, hired someone to act as a program manager. She lasted about 6 weeks. Elections were 2 months away. I had spent my time sort of helping with the protest and organizing. So the plan was, all right, you would sort of manage affairs until elections, and then after elections, we'll hire somebody else. Yeah, that was 9 years ago. We're still here waiting to hire somebody else. But I think more fundamentally, it's really, both my parents are academics. I grew up on a university campus. My father was a student activist when he was in university. So, and my mom, who died 18 years ago, in my opinion, it was just a rock star. She, in her life, traversed very different spaces, but at the heart of it was just really a heart of empathy and justice, really wanting people who were out of structured society to be connected in one way or to be remembered in the way society was run. So a bit of it, I'd say, it's my upbringing, and then quite a bit of it, I'd say, it's also what is now called enlightened self-interest. I really don't see why people a certain group of people get to determine if my life is easy or miserable. I don't give them that power, and I refuse to give them that power. So in my mind, there's a constant battle to take that power away from Nigeria's elite class, political elite, who in their warped mind are choosing to run the country the way they do. So yeah, it's really the journey to the organization, but at the heart of it is really about my own sense of justice and fairness. Thank you.
Yeah, the power of the protest and the people who bring us into the movement. So Salim, maybe over to you. What brought you to doing this work?
I was born in Kabul, Afghanistan in 1978, about a year before the Soviet army marched in, and about a year before, or around the time when Western world was financing what they call nowadays in Europe Islamists. Back then they called them freedom fighters, of course. But that's how geopolitical narratives change. So I've lived a life of migration and refugee status myself. Of course, 9/11 changed a lot for me as well, because suddenly I realized that I am targeted everywhere I go, at every border, at every airport. I will be singled out. And this has been without an exception. It has been the rule ever since, wherever I travel. On the other hand, there's Roberto Esposito is an Italian philosopher who deployed a method of looking at a domain. He looks at philosophical and political domains, but generally looking at a domain from its limit points, from its thresholds. So when I arrived for a conference on Lesbos in 2016, I realized the significance of this border space, which signifies so many things between East, West, Europe and its other, and so on. And I could not let go. As a social researcher, it was, you could say, a gold mine of social research, understanding Europe and the West from its threshold, its behavior at its limits and its borders. So that's how I ended up here, and it's been quite a revealing journey, so to speak, although quite heartbreaking. If you were in the keynote talk earlier, you kind of feel a little bit what we witness here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for that, Salim. So excited to hear more from you later. And then Dalia, who are you and what brought you to this work?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here and giving me an opportunity to speak. I still feel like, I actually still kind of like surprised that I'm like, I find myself in this amazing panel. But that aside, I was born in Egypt, and as a toddler, my parents moved from Egypt to work in Saudi Arabia, like many Egyptian professionals at the time, leaving my siblings and I back in Egypt. So I grew up in a transnational family, and I never thought much about it. It was just like, part of being. Fast forward 20-some years later, I found myself writing about transnationalism and migration. So it's not a coincidence. But actually, even though I grew up crossing borders and internalizing borders in so many ways, it wasn't until I moved from Egypt to start my PhD in the States. Even though I've been to the States before, the day I arrived as a graduate student at the airport, I experienced something that really changed my life forever. Even though I had gone, through the process, jumped all the hoops to get my student visa and be able to, move to the States. Upon arrival at JFK, I was told that I have the wrong visa, and of course, it was not my fault that they gave me the wrong visa. But nonetheless, I was asked to go to a back room and see things until they kind of like made some phone calls and look more into detail in my papers and all that. But that experience of being in the room, even though I had not done anything wrong myself, I've followed the process as was explained to me. Just looking around to see who else was in that room and what was going on, I couldn't help but notice that everybody else in that room was my skin color or darker. That was an experience of borders that was very different than anything I was used before. I've seen before, kind of like it allowed me to see that borders are not neutral, and that the border regime, the border system, it functions according to obvious to some color lines and also class lines that I was only able to see for the first time that day. And that shaped my academic life, forever.
Thank you, Delia. And I just realized I, expected all of our panelists to kind of pour out all of their personal experiences, and I didn't even introduce myself. So I'll just say, my name is Marzena Żukowska. I am an immigrant rights activist. I'm originally from Poland and grew up in Chicago, undocumented for the first 14 years of my life. And that was probably the big experience that really politicized me around these issues. Similar to Yemi, I also grew up with an incredibly strong mother who had done domestic work for 20 years. And so that kind of further politicized me around the intersections of workers' rights, immigrant rights, and then obviously so many of the other issues that we focus on. So thank you all to such a brilliant panel of speakers. So the first question I'm hoping could really set the scene for all of our attendees and help us understand really kind of further where everyone's coming from. But so to the panelists, how do you understand the concept of a hostile environment in the context of your work around borders, around freedom of movement, around policing, and even state repression? Does this terminology and this concept resonate? And then also, how does it manifest in the context within which you work, whether those are local, regional, or community level? So hostile environment, how does it resonate? And so Salim, maybe starting with you and all of the incredible work that you're doing on the island of Lesbos.
Thank you. Hostile environments, I have to say that I will not talk about a lot of details. I hope you all were present at Elena's talk, because there are incredible similarities between Eastern and Western Mediterranean as what is happening and so on. So I will just point out briefly that hostility is what drives people to forced migration. The environment has to be hostile. Where this hostility comes from is another question that I will address in a second. But from that moment that the environment that they live in is becoming hostile, to the decision to make to travel into the unknown and the unfamiliar, to the contacts that they may be shady, they might be smugglers of all kinds. And I have, I mean, I don't want to get into the details of that, but I've interpreted, for example, for a woman here, for lawyers, who was for a month locked up and raped again and again in Istanbul by the smugglers, from fathers who lost their son along the way, a 12-year-old son. So the hostility doesn't end just, it's a continuous thing. And in the sea, Helena talked about pushbacks. The Greek authorities officially, recently Spiegel.de, a German newspaper, came out with report that Frontex is watching pushbacks, at least if they don't participate. So it's hostile up until arrival, but it doesn't end even there. The police services upon arrival, the asylum services, the food distribution, where 7,400 people have to line up 3 times a day for meals that are barely edible. So this hostility that never ends. But also the politicians and the media, as Helena pointed out, are really playing into this hostile environment. And consequently, the local population is, of course, charged with this hostility. And on the other hand, you have a whole hostile environment towards the people who have solidarity. Many young Europeans who come here to support and to help, they are criminalized. Just on Thursday, 2 days ago, a Canadian journalist, filmmaker, was arrested for filming an arrival based on charges of facilitating smuggling. So it's hostile in every way. Never mind that borders are never leaving a refugee or a migrant. The refugee that ends up in Athens, if they manage to leave the islands, because the islands are prison islands. You are not allowed to leave the island. If they manage to leave the island and be in Athens, on every street, at every intersection, and on every square, you are targeted because you are not looking European enough for them to let you pass through. So it is a highly hostile environment from the beginning. And where this beginning comes from, and I am endlessly indebted to this situation, unfortunately, at the cost of suffering so many thousands of people, to have come up with a manuscript that I'm about to finish, hopefully early next year. And in this manuscript, I turn around and then I try to use this experience to intervene into our theoretical understandings. For me, in this manuscript, borders are the physical manifestation of metaphysical violence against life. You see, metaphysics not just as we understand in terms of theology or philosophy, but as a way of life, of separating, hierarchically separating lives. As Helena pointed out, that there are lives that are deserving and lives that are not deserving. And this is the violence. And therefore, I believe, and I want to cut it short here, that the problem is the way that Europe thinks. You see, European interests don't have borders. It is the people who are affected by European interests who are facing this border violence, right? So it is a bit psychotic on European and Western position to enjoy their fantasies, so to speak, the desired lives at the cost of the lives of others and life at large. We cannot forget that the entire drive behind climate change has been also the Western world. Believe it or not, Africa didn't contribute to climate change. So all life has been affected by the fantasy of Europe to live its fantasies at the cost of all other lives. And this is the true hostility, when you cannot envision yourself as a responsible living being, when you cannot live your freedom with responsibility. That is not freedom, that is pathology, I would say. So for me, hostility is defined in this relationship of the West with its other in this pathological manner.
Thank you, Salim. Curious, Alia, if some of this resonates with the kind of work that you've been doing with Migrants Organize and Patients Not Passports in the UK.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to give context, right, as Marjana mentioned, the hostile environment was an actual name given to a set of policies by the government brought in sort of after 2010 under then a conservative-led government. And it was about the expansion, not the introduction, the expansion of immigration enforcement into many different areas of life, of society. It created this and expanded this sprawling web of immigration controls embedded within and throughout all kinds of public services, designed to criminalize everyday activities to make life unbearable and unlivable for migrants, forcing them into destitution and towards exploitation. So we saw things like from schools forced to share children's data with the Home Office, landlords forced to check people's immigration status before renting them a house, doctors and nurses forced to check people's status before giving them treatment. The line was really blurred between immigration enforcement and kind of the vital public services that people need to live. And the kind of explicit purpose of these policies was to make life so unbearable, so undignified, so unlivable, from the government's minds, for this cohort of so-called illegal migrants, creating, as Salim and Helena mentioned, right, these categories of deserving and undeserving, who is able and entitled to access services. But of course, the reality of migration is there is no such thing as an illegal migrant. There are people who fall foul of racist and brutal immigration controls that are designed, I think, essentially as extensions of a colonial and imperial global structure to prevent the very people on whose backs the majority of the world's wealth, particularly in this country, our wealth was created, from accessing it. And so I think, although the hostile environment policies introduced from 2012 onwards were very explicit in that aim to make life for those people so unbearable, actually, this hostility that Salim was talking about has its ideological and political underpinnings from a very long time.
Yeah, excuse me. Can you slow down a little bit so the interpreter can interpret for you?
I know.
No worries.
So quickly, sorry. Thank you so much to the interpreters, and I will slow down. Yeah, so I guess the criminalization of migration is not a new phenomenon in the heart of empire. There are just, I think, moments in which it is more useful for the ruling classes to make that ideology much more explicit, as was the case in 2010, 2012, which followed, the economic crisis of 2008. And so, I think all of that is to say that, in the UK, we talk about the hostile environment as it relates to specific sets of policies that came in fairly recently, but I actually think that it is a much broader description of this practice, of the criminalization of the lives of undocumented people, the construction of those categories of deserving and who is not, and the embedding of immigration enforcement deep into the heart of society.
Thank you so much for that, Alia. And I'll turn it over to you, Dalia, since your work is also focusing on the European context, and then Yemi will kind of turn it over to you to share, the context in Nigeria.
So so my work now focuses on Northern Europe, and I'm based in Sweden. And in Sweden, there is no official policy of hostile environments. But it doesn't mean that it does not exist. So personally, I would define hostile environment as simply a system that dehumanizes human beings, as Salim was talking about, for having done nothing but, the only mistake that they've done is that they dreamt of a better life, of a better world. And in the Northern European context, we get the deliberate production of marginalization and suffering on part of governments using or relying on strong bureaucratic structures that enact that kind of hostility. So in Northern Europe, the hostile environment and constructing that, the bureaucratic structures are intentionally used to make life for certain groups of people within the nation state, to make life for them so intolerable that they end up leaving willingly, without having to cost the nation state to either break international laws or force deport people. It's actually cheaper for the nation state if people self-deport and if willingly remove themselves from the nation state.
Thank you so much for that, Dalia. And then Yemi, over to you.
Thank you. I'll start where Dalia left off about hostility being just dehumanizing. And I love how Aliyah puts it in the context of criminalization of immigration and the empire. So Nigeria is a former British colony. It was also a country that was created for commerce. It was nothing to the people that lived there, but it was an entity that made sense. Two separate halves that was joined together by a British lord because of access to the sea and ports made it easier to transport people and materials from all over the country to the ports. Now, having said that, this is Nigeria's 60th year since independence, celebrated 100 years since our amalgamation. But as a people, we've imbibed the sort of notion of not only dehumanizing, but looking at people within the context of how they suit an enterprise, so to speak. So I'll leave the sort of economic framing of neoliberalism and all of that and the impacts of that, but pick up on two things I think that Salim said earlier about politicians and media buying into this whole notion. And I'd say that it's not so much as they're buying into it, it's more the fact that they drive it. So within the Nigerian context, it is politicians that drive this whole sense of a less than, such that a part of, and so this is not even immigration from one less developed country to a more developed country, in the fact that people are looking for better alternatives, but it's my internal migration, if I want to use that word. So you have an environment that's shaped by government, where internally it is a hostile environment, not even to outsiders, but internally to people who are nationals of the country. So where people within the country don't feel like they belong. So you start with the artificial contraption that the nation is, and then you have a governance structure that makes a certain group, a certain ethnic group, or a certain demographic feel that they have more access, or more, not access, that in a sense, Nigeria is more theirs than any other person's. And it's within that you then create a hostile environment of a state where its citizens are not its priority. Its citizens are not, it's not a state that's driven by an ethos of service to the people that it calls its nationals, but it's driven by an ethos or an allegiance, if I want to say, to enterprise, or to the degree that the citizens help drive a commercial agenda in one way or another, either my own personal benefit as an individual, how can I run or structure whatever it is I'm doing from an enterprise perspective to make more money at the detriment and the welfare of other people who in name we're the same. So it's not a Nigerian migrating to the UK, it's a Nigerian that I think is less than. And I think that's, I think I'll leave it at that, that the framing for me about a hostile environment is not in relation to other contexts, it's in relation to a state that that makes it almost state policy to dehumanize not strangers, but dehumanize its own citizens.
Thank you for that, Yemi. And I know that we'll dig into some of the profit-making aspects of hostile environment shortly. I briefly wanted to turn it over to our MC Jamila again, because we actually were supposed to have one other panelist who was unable to attend for security and state repression reasons, which is the Azad Kashmir Liberation Movement, AKLM. And they've prepared an Open Borders Conference statement that I was hoping Jamila could present to us. Jamila, are you there?
I am here. Sorry, my own security concerns, clearly. Sorry about that. Yes, so I would love to read this statement very briefly, if that's possible, from AKLM. I would like to share my screen real quick, and I apologize up front that this is not translated. It's something that was a little bit challenging for us to kind of get together very last minute. I don't know which part of my screen you're seeing. Probably not things that I want you to see. It's a bunch of graphics, but it's fine. I'm sorry, one moment. Let me just get it up. Okay. And there we go. I apologize. Can you all see that? Great. So this is an Open Borders Conference statement from Azad Kashmir Liberation Movement, or AKLM. And I want to apologize up front for any names that I may mispronounce. I apologize. I just apologize up front. So under which rule are more than 20 political activists, including Babajan, Tanvir Ahmed, and I apologize up front, Iftikhar Karbalai, I'm so sorry, who demand for freedom, are shut in Pakistani jails. Despite Pakistan itself raised its voice on each and every platform for activists like Yasmin Malik, who are charged and put under arrest in Indian jails. We have lately observed on social media is that Pakistan has allocated a team of approximately 5,000 to 6,000 people who constantly put forth the atrocities inflicted upon Indians, but at the same time, they ignore when the same takes place in Pakistan. Kashmirs residing on both sides of the LOC had to face shell fire, which recurrently occurs in warfare from both sides. Around 1,000 people lose their lives yearly, and thousands more suffer grave injuries, leading their families in grief. Recently, on the 13th of November, around 30 Kashmirs lost their lives in a shoot fire between India and Pakistan. Who should be made responsible for this catastrophe? The demand the UN take stringent measure on the human rights violations that is occurring on both sides of the Kashmir. Thank you so much to AKLM, Kashmir Liberation Movement, for providing this statement and for participating in this, given your extreme security risks and everything that's going on. And I just briefly want to say, free all political prisoners. I'm so sorry that this is all occurring right now, and I hope that in some way that this conference and boosting this message will support your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamila, and thank you to AKLM again for providing that statement, despite the security risks, and hoping that our panelists can find ways to incorporate these ideas and words for the remainder of the session. So I want to kind of continuing on the thread that we've had around how the concept of borders extends far beyond geographic boundaries. I want to dig into the different kind of the specific and tangible examples of how borders have been used and expanded in very creative and often innovative ways by both authoritarian regimes on the one hand, and then also neoliberal capitalist regimes, right, liberal, on the other. And I know that neoliberal is one of those terms that is frequently used, but then often many of us don't fully, I sometimes forget what it means. So I just wanted to use a definition to kind of have us on the same page. And it's one that I know that Dalia will expand on a bit more as well. But in the book Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry, co-editors Siobhan McGurk and Adrian Pine frame neoliberal policies as ones that bolster markets above people, and then neoliberal discourse as one that bolsters the individual above the collective. So I won't say too much more, as I know Dalia is a bit of an expert on this topic. But for the panelists, in this context between the neoliberal and the authoritarian, how have each of you kind of tangibly and concretely seen borders manifest physically, institutionally, and ideologically in the context in which you are working. And Yemi, I'd actually love to turn it over to you because you've talked about the concept of borders within a nation and the borders that kind of impact and police identities in the Nigerian context. So I was hoping you could kind of expand on that and anything else you find important for this.
Thank you. Interestingly, it was until I was invited to speak here that I'd framed it in those terms. I mean, so I sort of understood the results of what I'm saying, and I believed it to be. But it was until we were doing a pre-call for this panel that I began to see how that translated into just sort of internal borders. So internal borders, and within the Nigerian context, and I'll use ethnicity, for example, as one that's dominated significantly because of the northern sort of Hausa Fulani ethnic group has dominated politics in Nigeria since independence, really. And so there's a very strong sense of a them as an other when you talk in terms of Nigeria's governance structure. So they want or they do. And if you look at it also from a cultural perspective, if as a nation we don't accept that because we're different and because our worldviews are different, our policies must be reflective of that rather than this whole notion of because you're different makes you less and makes you not welcome at the table. So an example like I like to use a lot is I'm Yoruba, southwest part of the country. And we're very celebratory when it comes to death. So if someone dies, you will do wake keeping where people gather to sort of see the body, say their final farewells, music, maybe some food, depending if the person is older. You will do a service of songs, which is a night of tributes and music, hymns, church context. Then you'll do a funeral. If the person is old, there'll be the church service, then there'll be the reception, and then possibly an after party. And then on Sunday, you'll do a church Thanksgiving. Now, this is all to send someone to the great beyond. For Muslims, and then not only that, then for those who are wealthy and can afford it, 1 year anniversary of the death, you can take out a full page ad, or you can even do a service to remember the person 1 year later. 5 years later, you can do another full page ad to remember the person. 10 years later, you can do yet another full page ad. You could do a service for families who are able to afford it. They can then donate something to their community in memory of the person who died, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. But for Muslims, very different attitude to death. Person dies, you bury them immediately, you keep it moving. Now, if you don't accept that influences how you see life and how you engage death and that process, and recognize that would influence how people behave and what their expectations are, it then becomes because it's different, it's bad, or because it's different, we don't do that. So as a country, we haven't taken time. We have 200 plus ethnic groups. So because we haven't taken time to celebrate and understand that diversity, that becomes points for difference. And in a sense, if we want to use that as borders, becomes borders that we implicitly lift up and then leverage to divide and leverage to have to close the doors, to access. So I think for me, in the notion of a nation, who, as I said earlier, created an environment where the state doesn't think of its citizens as equal, doesn't treat its citizens as equal, these things then provide opportunities for them to be leveraged. And then in addition to, and I'll just end with that, in addition to what ethnicity does in that regard is also how language becomes a border. So in Nigeria, when a particular, whichever ethnic group might be, is dominant in power, it's the president who's from this ethnic group or that ethnic group, the people who surround him will usually be from his own part of the country. And then they can then speak in their language. So you enter a meeting that's a national meeting, But because the person who's at the head of the table and his aides speak a language that I don't speak, they start speaking in a language that I don't understand. And there's no sense of the fact that that, again, is a border to inclusiveness and a border to the fact that we're discussing a national issue. And so you become an irritant if you don't understand, or they're like, oh, don't worry, you pick it up. Just keep paying attention. You figure it out as we go along. And now we say it sometimes jokingly, but I dare say that psychologically, the damage that that has done to us as people is something that we probably underestimate. Thank you.
Sort of opening it up, Alia, Dalia, Salim, if either of you wants to go next and share some thoughts and the kind of tangible, concrete examples of how borders manifest.
I can jump in really briefly. I mean, so the hostile environment here is manifested through, in sort of every function of your life. In any way that you would need to live a sort of dignified, fulfilling life, and, you know, not even just flourish, but just survive. What we've seen in sort of organising in the UK with undocumented migrants and also with migrants who have status is that the embeddedness of immigration enforcement everywhere is designed to create such fear in people, to create such extreme isolation and such a total sense of powerlessness. And I think that's politically very useful for the ruling class when our conditions are so, if I may say, shit, that it is extremely difficult for us to resist. So, you know, when we organize around healthcare, you know, people who are they get charged for their healthcare and they're not able to access healthcare. They also aren't able to access state benefits or any kind of state support. They live in horrific conditions, but they're excluded often from, tenants' unions. You know, they can, and if they then are lucky enough to get housing by the Home Office, there is no way to organise against that often. Many are unable to access education. People are required to report every week to the Home Office, which is a hugely dehumanizing and debilitating experience. People are in that process fear being detained and then deported, and people are forced, because they have no right to work, are forced to into exploitative working conditions, and then their ability to organize in unions is really criminalized. The same people are disproportionately stop and searched by the police and face racism on a daily basis. And I think that, you know, all of that experience is so, it creates this powerlessness. But I think the other thing that happens as a result of the hostile environment system is the kind of reverse, where people who are tasked with this immigration enforcement, where it's now become part of their job, if you're a teacher or a doctor or a driving instructor, what happens is that you are then required to classify people about entitled to healthcare or not, or as a migrant, as undocumented, as a Muslim, as a Roma person. And it creates this harmful logic of us and them, and it gives people the permission to manifest the prejudices, the hatred that has been stoked by the politicians, by the media, as has been spoken about already. So you then also have the kind of the powerlessness that is felt by people who are at the sharp end of this policy against the kind of increased power that people tasked with enforcing it feel. And I think that's exactly what the manifestations of state racism are. These policies are designed to turn us against each other, to turn communities against each other, even when we live in and amongst each other, which is, I think, what neoliberalism tries to do.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alia. And recognizing that we do have a limited amount of time for this panel, I'm going to drop in for Dalia and Salim a bit of the next question, which was around specifically profit making. So as you're thinking about the manifestations of borders, how does profit making also play into that?
Yeah, do you mind if I start briefly and then pass it to you so you talk more also about neoliberalism a little bit more? Thank you. So the one thing I had to say about neoliberalism, and it ties in very much with the third question, is, Michel Foucault held a seminar in 1978-79 in France titled The Birth of Biopolitics, in which he uses the word neoliberalism. It comes from the German and Austrian order liberals that he compares and so on. But the point that I briefly wanted to make was that for Foucault, neoliberalism means the management of society, the management of the lives of people in the service of the economy, in the service of capital. I mean, maybe that is an unjust summary of a whole seminar that he held, but for Foucault, that's what it means. And today, from the angle that I'm looking at this border, Europe's border is literally that management of global life. On the one hand, the necropolitics that Europe is employing towards migrants and refugees, both internally and at the borders. And on the other hand, the right-wing tending domestic policy that it's pushing through its media, through its politicians, which really divert from the fact that this neoliberal agenda that has been in place for decades, and Dalia can explain to you in more detail, they are trying to literally divert from that through this whole propaganda towards against migrants, against refugees, under the terms of invading our country, culture, Islamization of Europe, and so on. So when we are talking about neoliberalism, the necropolitics of the borders and the issues of refugees in Europe is part and parcel of this neoliberalism from the angle that I'm looking from the borders. But I pass it to Dalia to explain further on about the details of neoliberalism and so on.
Well, I feel a little self-conscious being labeled an expert on anything, especially neoliberalism, but I'll do my best. So I just, with a number of my colleagues, we just published a book with the title Refugees and the Violence of Welfare Bureaucracies in Northern Europe. And in the book, we take on like a number of important concepts to explain what's happening in Northern Europe today. And one of them is, and they're all connected. So one, just talking about borders, actually it's not just talking about borders, but it's a process of rebordering. So Helena, the keynote speaker, talked about the externalization of European borders, right? When Europe is kind of like subcontracting its borders to like, other countries to break the laws for them. But we also see that within Europe, right, since 2015, some borders that were, removed as a result of the Schengen Agreement are back. So Denmark has closed its border at some point with Germany. Sweden did the same with Denmark, right? And so like there's reenactment of borders, but it's not just reenactment of borders; it's rebordering, because these borders kind of like work one way and not the other. So it's only if you're heading north do you face these border closures. But if you're going south, it's okay, you can leave. But associated with that, it's like you're talking about neoliberalism and what's going on with neoliberalism, how it's affecting borders. I can explain that by talking about actually the language of risks. So it's from everything we've talked about today, right? I mean, there is this construction of the migrant, the refugee, especially as a risk to a security threat, right? But as a risk to the for the nation state. But in the neoliberal world, right, in the business world, risks are not things to just be avoided. Risks can actually be very profitable. And good business management, it's about identifying risks that are worth investing in and risks that should be avoided. So this is like how the border regime basically works, is working with, looking at refugees, these newcomers, these people crossing borders as a risk, but a risk that can be profitable, that can, they can be allowed in if they're worth investing in, but then also others who cannot, who should be avoided. And in this process, right, the migrant has to prove their worthiness for the nation state. They have to prove that they're not going to come in and ask for money from the welfare state, but to prove to them that they're going to work and they're going to do everything it takes to be integrated, right? To be the good citizen who will, be profitable for the nation state. And this, I mean, there are many, many examples that I can bring up, but like I will just bring one quickly. I mean, almost all global north countries in the global north has this citizenship by investment option. That, right, I mean, all this talk about like, our countries being full, we don't want any more migrants, they're challenging, they're risky, they're this and that. But if you have the money and if you're going to invest, you're welcome to come and you get to the front of the line. And this is not just talking about like, people who are going to come in as investors, but also within the world of asylum seekers and like, the refugee regime. We've seen multiple examples where kind of like this expedited process, if you're proving your worthiness to the welfare state. I mean, again, you jump the line, you jump the queue and you get to the front. So Germany had specific programs for professionals and highly educated people and people with money who are applying for asylum. But if they're proving that they're going to be good citizens, then they got this special mechanisms. Sweden did the same thing. Well, in Sweden, I mean, if you're a physician or an IT professional, not only do you get to jump the queue, but also you get expedited kind of like shortened language courses, kind of like, people will work with you to make you, fit to work and join the economy as quickly as possible. And all of these things are, I mean, we need to understand them as like, I mean, it's a profit-making business. The whole border regime is just, it's about making money. That's not there.
Thank you, Delia. And then Yemi, I wanted to pass it to you if there was anything you wanted to add on the profit-making piece.
Yeah, definitely. Just to say that from an economic, as Delia said, just reiterating that from an economic point of view, risk can be costed. So in allowing certain types of people to come in freely, it's because you've costed whatever the risk they pose into their quote unquote their investment, if you use that phrase, or the ability to be taxpayers, which is why immigration policies for a country like Canada, you get more points the more educated you are, or the more assets you have as you try to migrate. But I had raised my hand to really just to add to Leah's point about how part of this, the system of borders, or the economics of borders, is keeping people feeling and like shit, to use her words, in a way that then sort of numbs you from what is happening. So within the context of Nigeria, we use the frame in literacy. So the more people you keep as illiterate, as poor, the more it empowers the borders that we have, and the more it disempowers them and keeps them dehumanized. So again, that ties, I believe, to the argument around the economics of borders as well. Thank you.
Yemi, and while we have you, we and our conference organizers might kill me for this, but I do have one more question that I briefly wanted to pose to all of the panelists, because all of you, in addition to kind of interrogating concepts of borders and exploitation, you're also kind of building visionary alternatives, and you're imagining different possibilities for how communities can be mobilized to actually challenge this type of profit-making, state repression, policing, and really all forms of borders and cages. So Yemi, could you kind of, thinking about the future, thinking about what it'll take to abolish borders, and what alternatives exist, what response would you give?
For me, I think in this season, in as much as there's been a lot of attack on social media, on the use of social media, both by platform owners and the way citizens and, again, enterprises, private sectors using social media to influence how we think, to influence how we engage. Social media, for me, provides both a threat, and the fact that the algorithms can be manipulated to reinforce biases and cause more divisions. But it also provides an incredible opportunity in terms of connections and education. In the Nigerian context, over the last 10 years, it has been social media that has given citizens a voice. So in the past, when you needed a lot of money to get on television or to get on radio, number one, and where those two platforms are also unidirectional. So whoever is on TV is saying whatever they want to say. Whoever is on radio is saying whatever they want to say. Social media is easier relatively because all you need is data. And in different ways and different shapes, data costs are coming down. So a lot more people have access. That's number one. And number two, it is unidirectional. So it's not just listening to propaganda from one side. You are able to respond. You are able to engage. So the opportunity that social media provides to educate citizens and help people see clearly. And so we've gone from text-based stuff to things that are now visual, so stories can be told, gives us an incredible opportunity, I believe, to scale the number of people who are educated and understand these issues in languages that are relevant to them. So not just in your dominant mainstream languages. But as we're doing that, we also have to be incredibly mindful that the counter to that is the ability that social media also gives to manipulate. So there's, for those who want to speak a certain truth and the way they see society and the way they see society growing, we have to be just as deliberate, just as strategic, just as almost, I don't even know what the word is, but really very laser focused around getting a particular narrative out in our way and be dogmatic about it, if I want to use that word. Sometimes it's used negatively, but really be dogmatic about it, because we need people to understand, to see clearly, and to have the facts at their fingertips. And I think that provides a great opportunity to connect people across countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yemi. Salim, maybe I'll turn it over to you. What will it take for us to abolish borders, and what alternatives exist? And also, people are asking what the title of your manuscript is. I think people are eager to read it, so just let us know and we could put it in the chat.
The title of the manuscript is Life, with the subtitle Radical Possibilities of Our Time. So my suggestion, or from my perspective and where I am working and these things I've seen, I believe at our contemporary juncture, not me, the thoughts that have been put forward, it is people like, for example, Silvia Federici and so on. We have two notions ahead of us that deconstruct, in a sense, and not in the Derridian sense, but they deconstruct or dismantle some of our prejudices that keep us in the same loop again and again. One notion is life, particularly the way Silvia Federici talks about the reproduction of life. Reproduction of life requires that we understand that we are connected to all life, that these borders that we have created and have been imposed upon us, they are not real. The real life continues only on the basis that we understand our dependence on every other life. So that's one way of looking past borders. The other concept that also Silvia Federici proposes is the idea of commons, or community as I call it, which opposes, or which allows us to step out of these dichotomies between private and public, where the public means the state only, right? The commons is a place of all, where we commonly come together and determine things. As long as we rely on the states and the politicians who are bankrolled by corporations, a world without borders and a world where life deserves its dignity, I believe is impossible. So for me, at the horizon of the juncture of this dark day that we live in our contemporary time, these two notions, life and commons, life and community, are the way to look forward. And hopefully, for the sake of life and for the sake of common good, as opposed to the public good, I would suggest that we pick on these themes very seriously and rethink them, and try to organize our communities and commons around these things that help us step outside of these frameworks that capital and politicians have created so far for us.
Thank you, Salim. Dalia and Alia, as briefly as you possibly can, encompass your vision for alternatives and also a way of abolishing borders, what would you say?
I want to quickly say that, like, if we go back to the definition of a hostile environment, right? It's kind of like it's making things so miserable for people that they end up leaving themselves, right, on their own. I mean, for me, this is a sign of, you know, the nation state basically running out of options. It's a sign that the nation state is desperate, right? I mean, we've had borders, we've had fences, we've had, you know, people who were left to die in sea or in deserts. We've, you know, separated families. Some nation states have put children in cages, right? I mean, the nation state has tried everything it could think of, and now there's nothing else to left. It's just like, you know, let's make people desperate so that they leave. And this actually should be taken as a sign that, like, okay, well, we people on the other side are actually winning the battle because the nation state is running out of options. So a simple stay the course. It's like, you know, time is on our side, really. So I'll stop there.
Alia, close us out.
Very quickly, I guess, sort of the corollary of that, from an organizer's perspective, I think, you know, the hostile environment seeks to turn everyone whose responsibility and role it is in society to care people, to nurse them, to teach them, into border guards. And so I think our role must be that to recruit everybody who is being turned into a border guard to our campaign instead, to be fighters for justice, for dignity, to stand up for everyone's rights. And I think that's very, very important, because this fight is about something so much greater, you know, for the heart of our public services, against privatization, against corporations profiting from the systems and services that we need to live. So it's a fight for the kind of society that we want to build, which is the mission of the Patients Not Passports campaign. And I think it's important to recognize that that campaign is just part of something broader, which is about, sorry, I'm slowing down. I was trying to be quick to stay to time. But we're campaigning in the context as part of a wider struggle. The policies and practices of the hostile environments in all its manifestations that we've spoken about today emerge from the legacies of colonialism and ongoing imperialism, which still underpins the West's relationship to migrant communities today. So I think part of also what we have to do is exactly what this conference is doing, which is bringing us together in conversation and collaboration, working across borders for a world that we want to win.
Thank you so much to Salim, Dalia, Alia, and Yemi. Read their bios on the Open Borders Conference website, follow their work. They're all brilliant thinkers